Thank you everyone for coming to today's important seminar. We are very privileged to have Jenny join us today. And before we start with the lecture, I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we have met today and pay our respect to their elders, past, present, and emerging. So Jenny is a global star, and I believe that everyone knows her. But for those of us who do not know her, Jennifer is a professor of geography at UCL, and she also remains a leading proponent for global comparative urban theory. And she also the author of Ordinary Cities, among many other books important books that she has published. So today, Jenny has joined us to share with us some ideas about some predicaments across the global south, basically focusing on Africa, looking at African urbanization and urban theory. And I encourage everyone to listen and also engage with her after the presentation. And Jenny, apologies for the technical glitches, but our expectation is that between 30 to 45 minutes, you should be able to deliver a lecture. Then there will be opportunity for us to engage in terms of question time. So over to you. Thank you so much for agreeing to do this.
Well, thank you very much for the invitation, and it's lovely to meet on screen anyway, Kim and Patrick, who've been... Can you hear me? All good? I'm just seeing you looking perplexed, Patrick, so...
We can hear you now.
Okay, great. All right, good. Well, it's lovely to meet Kim and Patrick, whose work I've enjoyed over some years, and also to see on screen some dear friends, Sue Parnell, who's now with you, and Alan Morris, who I haven't seen for must be decades, Alan. So I just really wanted to acknowledge the statement that Patrick read out, which I know you do in Australia a lot, around the communities who settled and were living in the area when our ancestors settled there. And I say that because I've recently discovered that my great-grandmother was in fact born in Footscray in Melbourne, who I met when I was a young child. And our family, various branches, moved out to Australia probably in the 1840s, from Ireland, from Cornwall, and then to Durban. So many people moved to Durban. So I guess to acknowledge two things, that is that statement is meaningful for you and for myself. Often it's read out as a formality, but the role we played was very relevant. And then to also acknowledge the connectedness amongst our places. So for me, that's a very personal connection between Melbourne and Durban. But I recommend a book to you, which you probably don't come across, which is this book I really enjoyed called Showdown at the Red Lion Hotel. And it's written by a South African historian who has some fame and notoriety at various moments, Charles van Onselen. It starts with Manchester and the terrible seeds of industrialization there and movement of the sort of lumpen proletariat, if you like, white settler movement around empire, which connected up many places. So our fortunes, our places are highly connected up. And that's a very important story, not just for us personally, but for the understanding of cities, of urbanization today. And I think this is one very important theme for me, the connectedness of different urban contexts, which makes their production something of a shared process globally. So this shapes how I turn to think about the cities that I work on, London, Johannesburg, and at the moment a project on Accra, Dar es Salaam, and Lilongwe. So these connections drive us to think our cities in a wider world of cities, I wrote once, but also analytically within the circuits and circulations that are shaping cities. These draw us to think across them rather than to segment and isolate them. So that's been a theme of my work for a very long time, and it will be shaping our analysis today. But there's another sense in which our cities are connected up, and that's through us. through us as researchers who question and puzzle and read each other's work and are engaging in the production of ideas which are more than located in one place. And that has been the inspiration for the book I recently published called Comparative Urbanism. So to share those thoughts with you, the focus of what I want to talk about, because I think it could be relevant for much of the work that many of you do, is really to think about some of the terms that hold us back from working with those connections, the connections either of the ideas we share and work with or the empirical connections that link cities together. So I've become exercised by the way in which, in order to try and transform urban studies, we perhaps have got stuck again into certain kinds of framings which segment us, rather than working with those prolific connections, either empirically or analytically. So I'm start off, excuse me, just with a couple of groundings that are going to shape what I want to say. So provocations, really. So the first question is, how is difference distributed in urban studies? And here in the book Comparative Urbanism, I took a lot of inspiration from Gilles Deleuze and his ideas about production of difference and repetition. And this is one of his famous statements, which says that difference, the ways in which he thinks about the production of concepts across the variety, the complexity of the world, is not diversity. Diversity is given. It says to us, it's given. We see a person, another person, a subject or object that's already formed, and we see a diverse world. But difference for him is more fundamental. It's that by which the given is given, that by which the world, the given, or the things, the manifold, the whole world is given as diverse. So we see the production of entities, but these are things that we need to track how they are produced and question our assumptions about their existence, and that is the form which our observations need to take. And I think this is one of the deep questions that I would have about a term that we use very quickly and easily, say informality, which assembles our observations, assembles differences into something which seems to be a clear concept and entity. So to question the production of the concepts that we make foundational for our analysis or turn to very quickly and easily. The other question that's driving my analysis, which is focusing on urban development politics, is about how actors from different scales are active together within urban politics. So we might call this an assemblage, or think about it as a transscalar arrangement that is associated with any territory, so that the city itself is not a given entity, but assembled through the political processes across whatever scales we might have in mind. And obviously we need to deconstruct that term too. And then I think many of us are very eager to join in projects of decolonizing our inheritances in urban studies, and this was the focus of Ordinary Cities. But I wonder to what extent we sort of subtly reintroduce different kinds of divisions and assumptions, which might have us still occupying some kind of colonial present. So that's my questions. So the thing that hooks some of my comments today then is the way in which a few terms which we turn to very quickly to try and help us establish a decolonized urban study, something that speaks differently, speaks from that which has been excluded, can resettle ourselves into a diverse world that we need to perhaps interrogate and think about how is the difference of the urban world produced. So the Global South, for example, I would say is a term we turn to rather too readily, and that it's important to remember this is a relational term. I would say provocatively, and especially into this audience, I would say very provocatively, informality has become a redundant term. And the provocation is to start to think about the actual processes that have been marked by this term of exception. And the third is and with Sue in the audience here, who's made such a strong contribution here, to think with the developmental projects that link and connect and interrogate and try to transform poorer urban areas, that this has both an opening and potential, but also perhaps some restrictions to bear in mind as we try to move into a globalized urban studies. So very quickly, because this will be very obvious to most people, we have many ways in which the term Global South operates in our field. So starting off with the geopolitical relationship of the third world, the non-aligned movement, the South as a interrogation of the distribution of poverty, and then the turn to the Global South, which I think we forget what that meant. Global South, excuse me, I just quickly switch off my email because it will just keep on pinging at us if I don't do that. Apologies, I had to get in to join you. So just give me 1 minute. Okay, so thanks for that. The Global South then indicates the relationality of that poverty, of inequality and underdevelopment, not that it's located to places. We're not talking about countries. The Global South is not a collection of countries, but the relational and globalized production of poverty, its interconnected formation, which has generated a lot of super productive work, in a sense, as an articulation of that which has been excluded. The Global South has been a great banner, but I think it's quite important to, as we start to probe and push for more globalized urban studies, that we realize that this is not a line or a collection of countries, a line in which Australia is often some sort of bump, but a relational concept indicating the complex distribution of poverty through interconnections, the labyrinthine capillaries of connections of capitalism, as the Komarovs have argued. So the second term, which I won't dwell on very much, developmentalism, which I think Sue Parnell and Edgar Peterson and colleagues have been very powerfully indicating that as the effort in interrogating and implementing sustainable development goals proceeds, that the opportunity to reshape academic thinking in the tracks of those concerns is very powerful. And one example might be in terms of the challenges of building urban capacity, local government capacity, and building effective multi-level governance as stated here. I would say that the sort of limits of that are that, in fact, there might be a policy imperative to build local government capacity. But as you'll see from the empirical research that we've been doing in our case studies, in fact, the opposite is the empirical tendency, which is that there's a concentration of capacities around urban development in central government actors, and in fact, perhaps a weakening of local government. So, and perhaps some of the limits of developmentalism might be that it drives us to highlight differences and to be wary of building a wider analysis. So on the one hand, I think Sue and Edgar are really powerfully making an important contribution here in the call to transform urban studies based on the distinctive experiences of not just cities across the African continent, but the scholarship and nature of the conditions of work of scholars across Africa, which needs grave attention if we're to transform whose voice counts in urban studies. So this is a very important project, but there's also a tendency to think at the same time that African urbanists might become more central to the collective act of urban theorizing, which is a call that I very strongly endorse and take up here. But that also being alert to that developmental imagination, which defines difference across cities, means that we start to feel uncomfortable to put urban contexts within a framing either of empirical connections or of analytical concerns. So I think in the project I'm working on at the moment, we're quite eager to not only bring our experiences in Dar es Salaam, Lilongwe, and Accra into conversation with urban studies more generally, but also to start to build knowledge across these different contexts. So this is where I think there's some conversations to be had. So the third theme, which I think we jump to quite quickly to identify the diversity of the urban world, as opposed to thinking with the complex differences of urban life, both internally within each urban context and across the urban world, is the idea of informality. Now, we'll hardly need to rehearse the history of this term to this group, but if we're thinking about informality as a term to index the difference of certain economic activities in the first instance, but a term that really exploded and found a home in so many places, thinking about the production of settlements, of housing, of governance, the informality of the institutional work of any government or entity. So informality captures an otherness, if you like, of certain urban contexts and certain kinds of processes. And it's become a very big term. It holds such a lot. So my suggestion is that perhaps it needs to be, it's done a lot of work, a bit like Global South is giving us a platform to speak the excluded in global urban studies, the excluded in our conceptualization of the urban. But I think there's a lot of movement beyond that to move into some new tracks. And so, for example, Gautam Barnes' great paper, which was presented in 2018 at the African Center for Cities 10-year anniversary conference, I think. This paper, he feels that he wants to produce new vocabularies for urban studies based on practice. And this is practice largely in areas which we would call informal, but he pulls out the actual dynamics that are shaping that practice. Squat, repair, consolidate. These are the dynamics of urbanization. And I think this is a really important aspect of perhaps the work that you're doing. And Kim kindly sent me this great book here to understand a bit of your work. And this, I think, is a very important dimension of how informality as a starting point opens out to so many branches of reflection about the complex production and experience of different kinds of settlements. So the autonomously produced settlement in many cities is the dominant form of urbanization, the large-scale urban development, if you like, that which people are making. So to call it by a label which stands for that which has been excluded is perhaps asking for us to generate some new suggestions. So the other sense in which informality has been quite important is in thinking about the practices associated with states, planners, government actors of various kinds, and that there's a sense that in many contexts these do not follow some bureaucratical hierarchical process, but are associated with all kinds of negotiations, inventions, etc. And I think here is the site where this is the kind of area that I'm engaging with more, thinking about how we understand stateness from context, which we might see as characterized by highly informal governance. But can we bring that into a wider conversation in urban development politics is the question. Patrick, can I just ask you, because I've come downstairs here without my watch, so could you just tell me when you like me, just like 5 minutes to stop, if you don't mind? Yeah. So state agency then, here a study from 3 students associated with UCL, in fact, but they wrote a fantastic paper looking at 3 very different contexts, Bafokeng, Guinea-Bissau, Tallinn in Estonia, and Berlin in Germany, and seeing how in each case the dynamics of governance loosened, that there were various kinds of inventions and actions outside of the hierarchical bureaucratic context, including in Germany. And here Hannah Hilbrandt's book takes that forward in a strong way. So really opening up something we might call in a black box informality to think about actual forms, actual practices of governing, which are common in many places. So the idea of legal voids. So here's an entity which has no regulatory context, is something that Patrick Legales pointed out in relation to Paris, or selective enforcement for various reasons, or how active state agents may operate outside of the governmental rules, and this could happen in many contexts. So I think a call from Jairaj Sundarasan writing about Bangalore to suggest that talking about informality, implementation failure, corruption, these are not for him very helpful ways to explain what is the planning system in Bangalore in his view, which is made up of the networks, associations, and practices to do with planning violations, which are really very much the norm. So these are the texts that have been occupying me over many years: Ordinary Cities, 2006, and trying to pick up the wager that all cities should be considered as locations for theorizing the urban into a comparative analysis, which grounds itself on those two moves that I highlighted in the beginning: the move of tracking connections across cities, which draw all kinds of cities into conversation with another, and being alert to our own trajectories, the trajectories of ideas, their sources, origins, and destinations, and to put ourselves at the center of composing generative and productive comparisons. And the handbook emerges as quite a lot of people are experimenting with different ways of trying to do comparison. So in terms of the Deleuzian quote at the beginning, in the Comparative Urbanism book, the last chapter, which I routinely try to advertise because I'm sure it's a very long book and anyone who starts out may not get to chapter 11. But chapter 11 is a place where I think the idea that we can produce new concepts with creative abandon almost from based on our observations to displace the inherited weight of concepts or the sort of holding place terms that we've turned to as we try to recraft global urban studies. So in a sense, I turn to the side of urban experiences, which many, excuse me, have seen as a site of opacity. The reason we can't theorize, differences are turned away from each other, Malik Simone suggests. Nobody wants to be drawn into a conceptualization, or if you're looking through a more materialities or actor network theory perspective, in a sense, we might only just stumble across maybe a concept or a connection made in a very local sense. Actually, if we go into that philosophical dimension, it's from the distinctiveness and opacity of urban life that we find an opening to generate new concepts based on our assessment, our observations of many kinds of different experiences. So we might have, faced with the complexity, distinctiveness, inscrutability of any urban territory, might say, oh, this is incomparable, differences are turned away from each other. Which is Simone's point, although his practice is rather different as he composes his concepts from his experiences in many different contexts. Materialities also leads to a very narrow sense of conceptualization. So Lancioni and McFarlane's great paper suggested we can maybe make small concepts and we don't want them to go very far because they would stop being faithful to the context they're talking about. And on the other hand, Philippe Dubuc's great analysis of Kinshasa suggests that there's an urgent desire and demand to actually make sense of the urban context in which people are living, to express that in various ways. And I would say that in terms of generating concepts, on the one hand, we might be looking at very fragile assemblages and compositions of urban life, perhaps indicated in the top sculpture but as we see in the bottom image there, the production of a vast urban space, the corridor across the West African context, is the result of these small activities. And to see it, we have to piece together all kinds of observations, but produces a very substantial concept. So just because we're producing concepts through difference doesn't make them meaningless. And this is just to flag a range of the resources that are there in chapter 11, which turn to Deleuze and to Walter Benjamin to think about how it is that ideas emerge out of our many observations. They flash into our minds, ideas, and Deleuze talks about this. Each time we turn to try and understand something, each throw of the dice, all of the possible ways of thinking about the urban world might be available. How do we interpret it? What concept might emerge? So rather than sitting with a concept that we've inherited or one that is easy to pin everything on, how do we create new concepts creatively? How do we produce new constellations of our observations so that our ideas can come to life? So if we sort of think of this as a dramatic moment, how do we produce an idea we start with our observation, a singularity, which is not a distinctive place, but a very immediate observation of some kind, sparks our thought, the start of a journey of any concept. So perhaps this is how informality began, as an idea. How can we understand this economic existence? And concepts flash up in the conditions of their creation. But many different concepts might emerge, many different ways of thinking the same concept might arrive. So what I'm quite interested in is the potential that this offers for us to craft an analytics of the urban, which opens to a multiplicity of surfaces and spatialities of interpretation. An urban now, if you like, something that's emergent into the moment, sits alongside many other conceptualizations. And we might therefore be quite inspired to generate our own concepts, to turn sideways, see the next door concept, to look at one that's quite far away. What can we learn from this world in which we're open to generating different kinds of concepts? So I'm thinking this is not about making a tiny concept based on one little material assemblage, but whatever we identify the urban might be. It could be a growth machine, a regulatory pathway. These are emergent, the actualization of our observations. So this gives us permission to destabilize the terms we've inherited. Where have they come from? What observations have they rested on? Why do we sit with that one? How does our observation undermine it? How might we suggest another term? I think this is, in a way, something that we might live in a much more open world of conceptualization, where we are more modest in the claims we make and more open to learning from others. So this in the middle here, U equals question mark, is a term that Neil Brenner presented in a talk when they were first thinking about planetary urbanization. What can the urban be in a world where the urban is stretched out along vast corridors or happening in very remote places? And here, just trying to say, perhaps we can expand that in a multiplicity of possible terms and observations. And these are just some examples of the kind of urban world we face, in which we genuinely are unclear what we're looking at. Not cities any longer. So the top left, Johannesburg in the center of that image there, stretching into a vast metropolitan region of Gauteng, for example. And so a lot of questions we have, which are quite fundamental, I think, need us to really open our conceptualization process. In South Africa, we're very perplexed by the emergence of what are effectively new cities, and very remote places, former Bantustans, which are growing very fast, while metropolitan regions like Johannesburg are actually slowing down a lot in terms of their growth, slowing down a lot in terms of the attraction of new young migrant workers. So the landscape of urbanization is stretched, is happening in all kinds of places. And we learn a lot from our colleagues in Brazil about how urbanization is impacting forests, mines, and so on, impacting the planet more generally, but also taking place in all kinds of places. And this recent text from Christian Schmid and Milica Topalovic puts that in a more broad analytical context. In South African urban studies, this is a challenge that we face to identify these new emergent urban formations. For example, here, if you look at the bottom right-hand side, this big red blob here is the Gauteng region where Johannesburg is. And then this is Maputo over here on the right-hand side. And with Phil Harrison and the Gauteng City Region Observatory with Nyaka Mosiane, especially, and Graham Gotts, we've been looking at this region here, which is I'm hoping you can see my thing moving around. The top sort of one third to the right, there's a concentration of yellow and green. And this is an emerging settlement composing all kinds of different rural, small towns, agricultural, displaced populations, betterment villages, etc., which are coalescing into a new territorial form, which the municipality likes to call a rural metropolis, but actually it just seems like a new city. So we've got a lot to think about. We need to generate new concepts. And the other thing about the nature of urbanization that we're observing is that as it's not happening in a form that we say, here's a city and a suburb, and we can analyze each city, actually we have to analyze all kinds of territories of urbanization. So with colleagues, with Phil from Johannesburg, with Fulong Wu here, colleague in London, we've been really trying to think about how can we try and understand urban development politics, not as a phenomenon associated with municipalities, which is very important in African contexts, as those municipalities are weakened and not really the key agents in shaping urban development. But how can we start to associate political formations perhaps with each large-scale development project and see how political formations emerge across different kinds of actors with different reaches, different scalar resonances. So this is the current project where we've taken, sorry, I didn't say what this was. This is a project where we looked at a large-scale development in Shanghai, Johannesburg, and London, and we allowed ourselves to learn from each one about how different actors are coming together to shape each urban development. And so with Phil, we've expanded this to try and think analytically about large-scale urban development politics in African context. And the key issue there is that so many developments are shaped by powerful circulating actors or transnational actors. So we developed a focus on trans-scalar politics of large-scale urban development with colleagues in Accra, George Busu, in Malawi, Evans Matunga, and in Dar es Salaam, Wilbert Kombe, trying to think about how these transnational processes, so these wider connections, are shaping particular urban developments. So this is to bring these cities into a wider framework empirically of globalizing processes and allow them to speak to that. So this is our lovely team of people. We focus then on 3 kinds of circuits which are shaping African urban developments: developmental, with the push of the SDGs, a lot of investment, but also for many years from actors like the World Bank or the development agencies of different countries. Private sector investment, and this has been interesting to us because I think there was a lot of hope that private sector, the wall of money of a financialized global economy, would arrive and invest itself in African infrastructure, but we find really none of that in our cases. So the private sector investments are more specific, often quite located, or come in the wake of either developmental or sovereign investments, which is, say, to think about one country's investment in another country, so China's diplomatic and developmental investments. Interesting to see what the nature of that is. So some data from 2018, we see that here, for example, the private sector, this dark gray, is very small. In fact, African national governments, just above that, put more into urban development than private sector. Still see a strong role for different kinds of traditional investors in development and trade. So thinking about the circuits, private, developmental, sovereign, as shaping urban development, we found ourselves questioning how we think about those circuits. So on the one hand, we have the metaphor of, say, analyses of neoliberalization or financialization, which see these flowing around the world and somehow slightly amended by the interaction with anywhere else, which then feeds back into how these big circuits are shaped, are globalized, which really privileges certain agents in defining what those transnational investments are like. So we very quickly, with provocation from Phil Harrison and Matt Lane, started to rather think about the metaphor of a circuit board, which might lend itself more to an actor network theory or assemblage perspective. What are the arrangements that are the actuality of mobility? Things can move, things can arrive because of the way in which different kinds of actors and territories are arranged. So we started to take more of a perspective, which is helpful then for bringing urban development politics into focusing on any urban territory, not a city as such. So we take from Ludovic Albert especially this idea of a transscalar territorial network to explain how resources from multiple horizons are pulled together in a given business property development from a fixed plot of land where perhaps a farmer or somebody with traditional land rights is operating to try and consolidate the capacity for the land to be investable by, say, a private investor from a distant committee boardroom. So all kinds of ways in which we can start to think of urban politics as produced and producing of different kinds of territories. And I think for us, this is quite important because we inherit within urban development politics, this architecture of the circulating circuit and the sort of municipal receiver of those circuits, which then is transformed in some way, but not very agentfully so. And this is influenced, for example, who I'm sure you know, Sophie Webber, based in Australia, this great paper about green structural adjustment, but it comes as a provocation based on policy analysis, as opposed to the empirical details of how is it that the World Bank's policies about resilience, for example, are being activated and translated into practice. Is it the case that we've got this powerful actor, transnational actor with a circuit, which then somehow is just mediated by and effectively transforming municipalities? So the final sentence here, where structural adjustment programs targeted nation states, very important point, think about neoliberalization in African contexts, municipalities are treated as the appropriate administrative unit. But actually, what we would say is that we're seeing the urbanization of the national government. So these are three cases. Lilongwe, capital of Malawi, very rapidly expanding, initially garden city, so fierce modernity, excluding the poor into dense slum areas, really very intense settlements on former traditional authority land or existing traditional land. Accra, which has grown so rapidly. So he has a great paper which outlines some of that huge expansion, which we can see in these two images here, and Dar es Salaam as well, which is growing hugely in physical and population terms, as in all three of these places, people are building on large plots, access through dual land authority, new housing, mansions, etc. The city is growing, cities are growing extremely fast. So they're very important to think about those processes. So we took three cases, one from each of our circuits in each of our cities to investigate. And we're at the stage where we've collected quite a lot of information about each case, and we're about to meet and start to think them together. So we have just some preliminary analyses to offer. And here, this is in the way of showing how it is that the national state, the national government has become a focus for each of these circuits, and also to insist that we're looking at this transcalar process whereby all the different actors, powerful transnational actors, national government actors, to some extent, maybe local governments or communities, are reshaping urbanization through specific projects. And so this is work from Silvia Cresa and Wilbert Combe, looking at Dar es Salaam and telling a story about how the World Bank has become a powerfully embedded actor. So having a lot of money and a lot of programs and really shaping urban development there, but in a way that is very long-term, very embedded and very interlaced with governmental actors and capacity there. If we turn to the case of Accra, here we see an example. The example we're looking at is the World Bank's Great Accra Resilience and Infrastructure Development Project, resilient infrastructure development. Here, the story we can tell is one where the national government was very agentful in seeking input from the World Bank, seeking their response at a moment when there was a great flood which caused a number of deaths, and also building together the analysis, the institutions, and the procedure. So the government actors, many of them were involved in the co-production of ideas that underpin the GARID approach. So
Jenny, you have 5 minutes remaining, please.
Thanks, Patrick. So what we have observed in those two cases, for example, and which I'll turn to show you a couple of other cases now, is that national government actors are playing a very key role in all three of the circuits we're looking at. So in terms of sovereign investors, the diplomatic conventions mean that one embassy, one government negotiates with another government, which then controls and determines many of the outcomes. In terms of developmental investments, for example, the World Bank, they're obliged to negotiate with national governments who are the signatories to the agreements. And private actors know where the decisions are made and are strongly supported through perhaps various institutions, the embassies, to be able to access investment opportunities mediated and shaped by national government actors. So the different ways in which central government actors shape urban development through institutional competition. So here, one entity is trying to be the one that leads a large project to influence, competing out other kinds of actors, where all kinds of processes which are under the table or for the personal benefit of government actors, for example, especially in lands departments, can really encroach on projects. In Accra, the Garrod project is designing out so many places because they've been encroached on, and the government is not willing or able to impact those processes to enable an effective anti-flooding process to be put in place. And then in Lilongwe, we see a lot of ways in which private actors negotiate their development opportunities with powerful people in the government. I would say that in all three cases, and particularly we've picked up in Lilongwe, other agendas are going on as well. So these are agendas which seem to be fragmenting and dispersing anything we might think of as state or a coordinated governmentality. But actually, we also find a strong interest amongst different actors in pushing developmental solutions. So, for example, in Dar es Salaam, what happened is that the interest in supporting city governments and metropolitan level government was diverted by political action on the part of the president at one stage. That could be reversed in the future with a new president. But what has happened is a strong and powerful entity managing local government has emerged within the president's office, which now has a huge vested interest in managing the flows of World Bank funding for the Dar Metropolitan Development Project. So they are a de facto urban government who have very close relations on a daily basis with the World Bank. So it's a very different configuration to the circuit and municipality. The example of Accra sees a situation where the institutional competition was strongly at work, who leads, who's involved in the management of the project. So the planning organization is pushed out at one moment. A massively complex array of organizational arrangements are made to try and to run the project, but to include all the different interested parties is slightly dysfunctional. And I said, designing out encroachment. So they're meant to be large places to collect water to stop the floods affecting further down the road, but all kinds of encroachments have happened on that land. One of our interviewees suggested that some people within state organizations are responsible for getting access and allowing it to proceed. We also see a powerful relationship in which individual private sector actors in Lilongwe, for example, have been able to use the negotiated relationships between the Chinese government representatives and the Malawian government to try and build their business activities. And we've seen a massive array of, in the 2009-10 period when Malawi turned from Taiwan to China diplomatically, a lot of diplomatic investments followed, conference hotels and etc., leading to a whole new strip of development in the north of Malawi. And I'll just quickly jump to the one example that we have, which was a joint venture between a small Chinese company, which was a spin-off from some of that large-scale development, and the Malawi Housing Corporation, in which the government intervened to insist that this deal get made, in which the Malawi Housing Corporation give over land, sacrifice much of the profit share, and then really influence the continuing negotiation of that development, which some planners described as some invisible hands coming with great force down to influence the development, as if it was a sovereign type of investment. So that I'll just have to move on, sorry, it's from a slightly longer initiative. And then just to highlight that there's a strong also developmental push within Malawi, vision for 2063, in which a kind of homegrown focus on urbanization as an agenda for central government investment. So again, an urbanization of the central government, which is able to organize interesting new financial arrangements to fund infrastructure, the upgrading of this road in the center of Lilongwe. So if you would just allow me to question here, to wrap it up, Patrick, around the idea of the state. So the point here is this: we could go through all these examples and talk a lot about informal governance and deals behind the scenes and corruption and all that kind of stuff. But what are we really perhaps able to say more generally about stateness, about the role of different governmental actors and entities within urban development politics on the basis of our observation of urban development in African context, if we step aside from that rubric. So we are given some steer from these two authors here, Neil Brenner, who suggests that growth machines are also operating at a national scale, with his case over the United States, and Gavin Shatkin looking at Southeast Asia, where there are much more powerful states and funding available to think about the way in which it's the national government entities which are driving massive urbanization there. So what we would suggest is that as we come back to a more wider theorization of the role of government actors or stateness within urban development politics, we can draw on an African tradition of theorization in which we have ideas about negotiated statehood, twilight institutions. We can also relate this to a much deeper theoretical question, which is whether the state is something we can talk about at all. It's also a concept. And Timothy Mitchell suggests that this idea of state is an effect of certain institutional weightiness, for example. So our cases, and I think many other urban contexts, and certainly in other African urban contexts, direct us to think rather more precisely about what are the actors in government doing? What are state actors doing? Are they exercising powers of the state? Are they doing statecraft, or are they doing something else altogether? They're arguably investing, making arrangements and deals to promote electoral potential, to produce a personal power, to benefit themselves financially, to build their networks, to aggrandize certain institutions. All kinds of dynamics are going on under the banner of state, but actually these are a whole range of different processes, and whatever the state is, it needs to be seen as highly fragmented. So we argue that you can expand this to think more generally about questions of urban development. So we go back to Sundararajan, in which we want to look at the actual power relations, the actual networks and associations that are emerging to shape urban development, or in places like London that we might look more closely at what state actors are doing. And in the earlier project I referenced with Fu Longwu and Phil Harrison on Joburg, London, Shanghai, one of our main findings from my point of view, so I was Ms. London, was that we could look back at the state in London and see that actually actors are not behaving as if they were being state-like or pursuing clear governmental actions, but at one level they are pushing developments higher and higher, pushing profits as high as possible to extract value to enable that development to go ahead. So there are all kinds of moments when it could be that to understand the politics of urban development in other places, we find in experiences in African urban contexts not evidence of another concept which indicates its exclusion and otherness, but which speak very directly and powerfully to key issues within urban studies, whether that's to re-centralize national governments in theorizing urban development politics, or rethinking how we understand government and stateness. Okay, I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jenny, for a very fascinating and important presentation. And in as much as we have strong online presence, we also have quite a number of people here. And I know many of them may have questions that they want to ask, but we're also mindful of the time. So we may take about 2 or 3 questions, and we will let you go, Jenny. Any questions? Those online, if you have any questions, please use the raise hand button. Yes, please. You mention your name so that she gets to know you, although she can't see you.
Thank you. I'm Xiao. I'm
Can
currently. Hi, thank you very much for the presentation. It's amazing. I'm Xiao. I'm postdoc. I was postdoc working in the faculty. And my personal research interest is relevant to transnational investment, especially Chinese companies' transnational investment in Australia. In terms of housing and transport projects. So I just saw you mention about Chinese investment in Africa and build and road policies. I just wondering, because China currently facing economic decline in domestic market in terms of some housing project and infrastructure project facing financial stress. And I'm wondering, have you seen or observed any changes in terms of Chinese investment and Chinese invest project in Africa after 2017 within the time frame of the economic decline in China? Is it clear?
Yeah, shall we do one by one? That's a good question. I'm not sure I have a good answer to it though. So it is something that Phil Harrison at Wits University, who's a person in our group who's looking closely into the sovereign circuit, so he would have some stronger answers to that. But I think there've definitely been changes in China's policy, and one of the changes has been the way in which large firms, state-owned enterprises and so on can operate in terms of demanding, finding resources to invest in projects that they identify in contexts in Africa. And I think that's become less straightforward, and that there's perhaps increasing reliance on firms that have more of a presence as commercial entities or even as not state-owned enterprises. So it's a very murky area, but I think you would be best to look at how the landscape of the sort of request aid is changing, so that Chinese companies state-owned enterprises would have been able to find a project and then request that the central government invest in that. And I think that area becomes less smooth, that needs to be more work. I mean, the other thing we saw is how different Chinese state-owned enterprises or private companies work very hard to, once they've located somewhere, to expand opportunities. So the Henan Goji that we mentioned, it's a very small company, but they've located themselves across the region, Zambia, Mozambique, and so on, several ways, and finding a modality that works. So here they work on the fact that they have privileged access to government through the embassy relationships that they have, and to negotiate to provide housing for the few people who can afford a formal house, which is people working in government, so bureaucrats and so on. So getting a close arrangement with government actors, with housing authorities, and with institutions that provide housing for their employees within government. So this this is a very agile way of expanding what might be a dwindling overall investment in large-scale projects. Yeah.
Thank you
so much, Jenny. Dean, do you like to ask your question?
Sure, thank you. Thanks for the presentation, Jennifer. It was really interesting. My name is Dean Landy. I'm the Group Head of Urban Planning and Design for Endeavour. So I'm Australian. I've been an architect and designer there in Australia for 25 years, but now I'm living in Nairobi to lead the design of 6 new cities. So we're working in Accra, Lagos, Nairobi, and DRC and Zambia. So my question was, how does your research integrate the real-time learnings? Because all of those things you're talking about there, I'm grappling with on a daily basis. We're literally designing collectively across these new cities will be projected populations of over 1 million people. So I think the challenge I've found is having I've written a book on the topic around creating the vibrant communities, but it's implementing it on the ground with some of those economic pressures you mentioned, the geopolitical, whole range of complex elements, as you're well aware. My question is, how are you integrating that real-time learning from major development groups? And we're founded by a New Zealander, and we've got mostly all Kenyans and Africans in our team, but there's some of that Western input as well. And I try and balance that learned thinking with the context of the environment I'm working in. So again, question, how do you integrate real-time learnings from major developers?
How do we learn from yourself, for example? Is that your question? Or how do we take what we've learned more generally and share that information with other people?
Yes, and is the research taking inputs from the development sector or more academic research and government research?
Yeah, well, we've interviewed in each of our cases, we've interviewed as many people as we can persuade to talk to us from all different perspectives. And the interesting thing we found was that these large-scale developments, while they've been the focus of a lot of criticism within urban studies and seen as the way in which kind of transnational and globalized development is happening and how that might be very inappropriate, for example. We've not found an awful lot of the huge scale developments that you mentioned. So if I can just go back to the screen, these are the cases we settled on, and we started with a couple of very hopefulness that we get like some examples of huge satellite cities. The one we hoped to talk about in Accra, Hope City, dissolved in some very speculative land arrangements and political relationships, so nothing transpired. And we didn't find such huge new city developments going on. So the cases we have in the private sector, the one is to test to what extent new infrastructure investment in the BRT in Dar es Salaam is generating new kinds of investment along the road and in centers. And actually there's a vast investment going on there associated with a place they call Silicon Dar, and Mariam Jennes, who's a PhD student, is looking at some of those developments. But in fact, most of them come from the National Housing Commission, which owns nearly all the land, is doing all kinds of development. And the others are smaller scale or slightly larger scale investors, a few perhaps of Chinese origin, a lot of national businesses which turn to their own assets to do that development. And then we have one arguably a development which might be familiar to you, but not of that huge scale, but a shopping mall in West Accra, which is generating a lot of development around it, but in a way that's driven by the complexities of the dual land ownership. So all kinds of things are happening which actually undermine the investment. And this is the joint investment between South African developers and the Ghanaian Social Security Trust. So, and some, I think, an Israeli company. So this was meant to generate value for the pension fund, but in fact, the chaos of the development around it, including a China mall locating itself right next door, kinds of haphazard developments, infrastructure not being developed in huge amounts of housing, causing enormous flooding. So the one image you saw of the main road out of Accra being basically turned into a big river, this is a result of that kind of development. So here, yes, we talk to all the different actors involved and the private developer as well. So try and understand, how do you bring something forward in that complex environment? It requires all these negotiations to bring development forward. And then I mentioned the Chinese one. So these are actually not, they're not classical. So in a way, we'd wanted to interrogate exactly the kind of development you mentioned you're talking about, because this has been very controversial in African studies. Are these what Africa needs? Do we need these huge cities? Do we need investment in sewers and canals? And so this is, yeah, so we're very eager to try and draw some learning. So one of the starting points we had was, what benefit can cities and people get from these kinds of large-scale developments? What benefit comes to the public? And there's very few resources for that to, few mechanisms for that to happen within the cities we're looking at. So where you have planning gain in a place like London, and the planners are trying to extract value for some kind of public benefit, we see very little of that. The benefit goes to the back pocket of somebody, or to the opening for risk-free development for some investors. So it's, yeah, we're very keen to feed that back. So it'd be great to have a conversation sometime. Yeah.
Yes, that's happy to. We've invested around 5 billion of private funding into infrastructure to solve all of those things that you've mentioned there. So it could be an interesting one to connect on. We've set up our own water
Thank
treatment,
you.
Yeah,
Thank you so
energy
much.
and so on. So thanks.
Yeah, thank you so much, Dean, and thank you, Jenny, for the answers to the questions. I know many people have still have questions, but the conversation is only getting started. Those of us here in the room, we're heading towards the client. But before we do that, we just want to say a big thank you to you, Jenny, for making time early morning in UK time to speak to us, and we really appreciate your insight. And we hope this will be the beginning of connecting with you and speaking to us more on your work in progress. And those of you joining online, we say big thank you to you, and we hope that you join us in our future seminar series. So thank you so much, Jenny, and talk with you soon. And those of us here, let's show our appreciation to
Well, thank you so much for the invitation. It's great to make a connection, and I hope that we have many more opportunities to discuss and engage. So thank you.